I always loved visiting Grandpa in the woods. He lived up in the mountains of Montana, completely isolated, the nearest town being a good 30-minute drive away. He was a tough old man. Our grandma died years ago, so my grandpa, a person seemingly born in the wrong century, decided to move into isolation. Now that I'm in my 20s, I've really come to appreciate the isolation. No cell phone service, no internet, only a landline phone. We spent most of our time up there hunting, fishing, hiking, or exploring. My little brother and I go about 3 times a year. My little brother and I had arrived at his cabin 4 days after Christmas. It was early evening, so we settled in his cabin. At nights, we usually sit around the fireplace, have a few beers, and tell stories. Sometimes they're funny stories about Grandpa's time in the service. Other times, he tells scary stories. My little brother got excited when asked to tell a story. He said he had read a story about Wendigos, men turned into monsters. The Native Americans say Wendigos are people who had participated in cannibalism, and it shapes them into something terrifying. A man's body with a deer's head, hoofed feet, and all sorts of mystical powers. The power to change into animals or even mind control. While my little brother was telling us the story, I noticed Grandpa's face change. He suddenly got very serious and stopped my little brother halfway through the story. He said that's enough talk of Wendigos and that it's bad luck to talk about them. We all went to bed shortly after. We woke up early the next morning. The forecast predicted some light snow. It would be a perfect day for ice fishing. We geared up in our cold weather gear, packed enough food for 2 days, just in case something happened, and put on our snowshoes. We started down the hill from the cabin, and were making decent time. Grandpa knew these woods like the back of his hand, and after years of visiting them, both me, him, and my brother had a general sense of where we are. The morning started off plain enough. Grandpa was leading about 20 yards ahead of me, and my little brother was about 10 yards behind me. Following someone with snowshoes is incredibly easy. The footprints Grandpa was making were impossible to miss. I remember hearing a humming, like the distant sound of an air conditioner. I glanced to my right where I thought I heard the buzzing, looked forward again, and Grandpa's footprints were gone. That was the first thing I noticed. The second thing I noticed was the humming, and the third, it was dead silent, save for the humming. I looked back at my little brother, relieved he was still. He walked up to me, stopped, and asked where did Grandpa go, then asked where did Grandpa's trail go. I answered, I don't know. We decided our best course of action was to double back, try to pick up Grandpa's trail again. I knew we were about 2 miles to the lake when we turned around, and I knew we were heading in the generally right direction. We followed our own trail again for 5 minutes. Suddenly, Grandpa came storming out of the woods. "You dumbasses," he yelled at us. He began telling us about how stupid we were. How could we possibly get lost with his trail being so obvious? That we were smarter woodsmen than that. I stopped him and told him that his trail and he just disappeared on me, that we followed our own trail back, hopefully to pick up on his. He said about 10 minutes ago, he turned around and noticed we were just gone, and only his trail was present. His eyes suddenly grew wide. "I hear a buzzing," he said. He looked at both of us and said we need to make it to the lake. I suggested we go back to the cabin, but he said no. He pointed up the hill where his cabin was, and we could barely make out a white wolf. Whiter than the fresh snow, unnaturally white. I pulled my binoculars up and saw it was looking directly at us, not moving, just staring. I asked Grandpa if it was dangerous. He said not in the way most wolves are. He began muttering under his breath while wildly scanning the forest. I had never seen this behavior come out of him before. He quickly stated we make straight for the lake, no more than 10 feet apart. He pulled out a rope and made us all tie it to our gear. He always carried a .44 revolver when we were in the woods, no matter how far he walked from the house. Grandpa pulled his revolver out and stuck it between his belt. We reached the lake by about 4. The sun looked like it was going to set in a few hours. Grandpa let us out on the lake, stopped in the middle, and said we'll camp here. If you've never been camping before, a campfire is the big reason for camping. You can't have a fire on the ice, and we were exposed to the wind and whatever else was out there. Grandpa asked for my binoculars and began scanning the shoreline while my little brother and I set up our sleeping bags and covers. My little brother mentioned hearing something about buzzing, said it sounded like a beehive that was a little ways away. He suddenly stopped looking around and was locked onto something. "Is that a wolf?" I asked. He said nothing, handed me the binoculars, and pointed. When I looked in that direction, I saw one tall figure and 2 figures that seemed to be wolves. Looking through the binoculars, I could see a human-like figure. I say human-like because it had the head of a deer, unnaturally long fingers, and a hunched-over stance. Its skin was pale tan, and it had patches of dark brown fur. Its legs and arms seemed just a little too long for a normal person's, and the movement was jerky, like it was getting used to being on 2 legs. "What the hell is that?" I asked. Grandpa said that sometimes Native Americans would wear skins while hunting to blend in with the animals they were hunting. My thoughts immediately turned to, there is a mentally challenged and physically deformed Native American out here with 2 dogs who happen to look like wolves. My little brother asked what they were doing, as they seemed to just be circling the lake. They would move around the shore, look at us, look down at the lake, and move again. Grandpa said they were trying to get on the ice. They continued circling the lake, but the deer man, or one of the wolves, would always be looking at us. After sundown, Grandpa relaxed a little, said we should get some sleep and we're moving first thing tomorrow morning. I noticed the absence of the buzzing sound. However, I did not get much sleep. Because of the cold and whatever was stalking us in the woods, we woke up at sunrise and ate some food out of the MREs we brought. Grandpa was nibbling on a pound cake and scanning the shoreline with binoculars. He didn't spot a sign of them, and after an hour of waiting, we packed everything up. Grandpa said we need to move, and fast. Once again, we tied a rope between the 3 of us and began to hike back to the cabin. Grandpa's pace was unusually fast. My little brother was having a hard time keeping up. We hiked for 2 hours without incident, when suddenly the buzzing came back. It made all of us stop dead in our tracks, and we all began scanning the forest. It was very loud now, like we were standing next to a swarm of cicadas. Only cicadas do not come out in the winter. We looked ahead on the trail, and a white wolf was standing in the middle of it, on its hind legs. That's when I realized it didn't look like a normal wolf. Its teeth didn't fit in its mouth. Some of its claws looked like fingers. There were patches of missing fur on its underside. It let out a high-pitched, ungodly scream, and that's when we all blacked out. When I came to, I saw my grandpa and little brother laying down. First thing I noticed was the buzzing was almost deafening. The next thing I noticed, we were apparently set in a triangle formation, with the deer man in the middle of us. The deer man was more grotesque up close. It had ribs showing. It had pale skin with patches of fur all over its body. One antler was missing several points. The 2 wolves, or whatever they were standing outside the triangle, on their hind legs. All 3 were looking up at the sky, chanting. It did not sound like anything remotely human. It was like a series of garbles, barks, screeches, and a language I could not understand. My grandpa was the next to come to. He quickly pulled out the revolver and fired 3 times in quick succession at the deer man. There was only screeching now, and the instant after he fired the 3rd round, there was a flash of white light. It was a brief, but incredibly bright flash of light. All 3 of whatever the hell they were just disappeared. Next, my little brother woke up. "Move, now!" my grandpa shouted. He sounded terrified, and I've never seen the man scared or even cry before. "To the cabin! Move! Go!" There was more screeching coming from the woods, 3 different things screeching the exact same scream. My grandpa lifted my little brother up with one arm. "Move, you shit!" he shouted. "Move, you shit!" I ran ahead of my grandpa and little brother. When I reached the bottom of the hill of the cabin, I didn't see them. I didn't see or hear anything. No buzzing, no screeching, just the occasional gust of wind. When I got into the cabin, I shed my backpack and sleeping roll. I immediately went for my grandpa's rifle and nearly tore the cabin apart looking for ammunition. I had locked, then barred the door with a chair, ready to remove it with the first sign of my little brother or grandpa. Then I waited for what seemed like hours. I was coming down off my adrenaline rush when suddenly heard 2 more shots. A minute later, I heard 1 shot. That had to be Grandpa, I thought. Then nothing. I could only hear my breathing and the ticking of the clock. Hours passed with no sign of my grandpa, little brother, or those things in the woods. The sun was going down, and I was still completely on edge. I thought about going out and looking for them, and dismissed the idea. Whatever was out there is still out there. I decided I would leave first thing in the morning, go to town, and immediately notify the police. At about 10 at night, I heard the distant buzzing again. It was very faint, but noticeable, as there was no other sound. I then heard scratching at the door. The moon was bright enough to illuminate something like a deer head peering in the windows. Then I heard it speak, or trying to speak. It certainly didn't sound human or animal, but for some reason, there was a hint of my grandpa speaking. Its voice was inflexing and changing pitch constantly. It said or screeched to me, "You move, you shit." It repeated this, and then something was trying the door handle. The door handle moved slowly, then it began shaking. The whole door began shaking. "You move, you shit." Then it started banging on the door. "You move, you shit." Something started moving on the roof. "You move, you shit." Every time it repeated that phrase, it got louder. This went on the entire night. At around 5 in the morning, I heard more loud screeches. It sounded like there was more than just 3 of them out there. The screeching went on and on. Finally, 15 minutes later, it just stopped. Nothing. Completely quick. The only sound was the clock. After the entire night of this, I decided I would make for the truck an hour after there was no sign of these things, make it into town, and tell the police what happened. Eventually, there was a missing persons alert. The police found a truck a mile from the cabin that had crashed into a tree. The driver's side door was completely ripped off, with what appeared to be claw marks running near the edges. There were animal tracks all around the crash site, as well as the cabin. The cabin was completely destroyed. The front door was ripped off, and it was concluded that a bear had attacked the person inside after the driver had crashed the truck. They only found one body, a teenage boy with a bullet entry wound in the forehead.